Welcome to Persuasion Mastery Lesson 2. I'm Don Watkins. So I've tried to watch the show Game of Thrones at least 3 times, and in no case have I gotten past the first few episodes. And the main reason why is I just cannot follow the names and the characters. And it's not purely the show's fault, because clearly millions of people can do better than I can, and I am notoriously bad with names and faces. But the point here is that if you lack clarity, people disengage. And so even if you have every other persuasive tool in your toolkit, even if you do everything right, even if you write the greatest book or make the greatest argument, if you are not clear, nothing else matters. Now, clarity involves 2 aspects. One we can think of as internal clarity, and this is just your mind being in touch with reality and really understanding what you think and why. And then external clarity, which is your ability to convey your ideas to an audience clearly. And so internal clarity you can think of as its thinking method plus facts, and external clarity is being able to connect that to an audience and the audience's context. So if we're thinking about internal clarity, what we're really talking about is knowledge and achieving real knowledge. So a good starting question then is, what is knowledge? And I think it's helpful to have to do a bird's eye view of sort of the cognitive contents of the human mind. And the way I think about it is divided into basically 3 categories. We have percepts, that's the concrete things that we're aware of in the world. So right now I'm sitting in a room and I see my guitar. Upstairs, I could see, if I walked up there, I'd see my piano. You can imagine a drum set sitting here. These are just things that I perceive. And, it's our senses that give us access to this world of entities. And, this is not a uniquely human form of awareness. All of the higher animals, their base of knowledge, the way that they know the world, is through the perceptual level. Then what human beings can uniquely do is that we can classify and organize what we perceive. We can reach what can be called the conceptual level of consciousness. So concept you can think of as like a word. So setting aside proper names, every word is an abstraction that stands for an unlimited number of concretes that we can be directly aware of. So I said, I see the guitar, I see the drums, I see the piano. Well, guitar is not just this, combination of wood and strings in front of me. That's a concept that stands for guitars that I may not be able to see now, may have never seen, will never see. It represents, or it refers to every guitar that has ever existed, will ever exist. And then what that allows me to do is to file knowledge under that concept. So I can learn things about particular guitars that then that knowledge applies to all the other guitars I encounter. So it's not like every time I walk into a store and see, a new Gibson, I'm completely baffled by, what do I do with this thing and how does it work, and I know a lot about it just by virtue of the fact that it stands in a certain relationship with other similar instruments that I've encountered before. And so that now we have this incredible power as human beings where we can grasp knowledge that applies much wider than the specific things in reality that we've encountered before. Another thing to note about concepts is that we can form even more abstract concepts from concepts that stand directly for things we can perceive. So I can directly perceive a guitar, but I can also combine into a concept guitar, piano, drums, into the concept of instrument. And I can't directly perceive instrument, right? Like instrument is a perspective on guitars and flutes and all of these things that says, yeah, they're similar. They're similar sort of items, and so I can learn things about instruments that apply to all instruments, all kinds of different instruments. And I can go even further, right? We can see instruments as, just a kind of tool. And so the guitars and the pianos stand in a certain relationship of similarity to things like hammers and wrenches and snow blowers, and ultimately, depending on exactly how widely you think of tools, as cars and trucks and, like, I'm trying to think of construction equipment, but in any case, we get this wider and wider, more abstract perspective on concepts, and it expands and widens our knowledge and thereby our ability to deal with percepts. And this goes, much wider than we've even talked about. So take our widest, most abstract philosophic type concepts: justice, freedom. These, in the end, still stand for particular things that we can perceive, right? Like, you go in and you give a clerk $5 and he gives you a soda, and that is an act of justice. It's a trade where both sides benefit through voluntary interaction. Or you can have the opposite, right? You can have a police officer who digs his knee into somebody's neck for 9 minutes and murders him, and then that is injustice. So we have this abstraction, but that it refers in reality to these particular things, and it helps us deal with them. That is, when we see something that we label as an injustice, we're going to treat it differently. We have to act towards it differently than we would an act of justice, based on our knowledge about the causes and effects of injustice, the causes and effects of justice, and so these are really powerful tools that allow us to deal with the particular things in reality. And the way that concepts do this is through judgments. So if concepts classify and organize what we perceive, applying the knowledge that we file under our concepts is made possible through judgment. So a judgment, in philosophy, it'll be put as S is P. And so you can think of it as, cop digging his knee and killing a person that he's holding. That is unjust. So we're applying the concept of justice to this particular case so that we can evaluate it and take actions accordingly. So that's the kind of basic cognitive contents of our minds: percepts, concepts, and judgments. And for concepts and judgments to be knowledge, they have to be rooted in percepts. We have to be able to connect them to the things that we can perceive, because unlike percepts, which are direct awareness of reality and therefore infallible, concepts and judgments can be mistaken. We can form wrong concepts. We can group things together in wrong ways, which I'll talk about more later. And we can make false judgments. We can, misapply something. So somebody could watch, a cop with his knee on a guy and who kills him, and file that wrongly and say, I think it was just because I heard that guy had a what's it called, a fake $20 bill. And then you'd have to think, well, does that really follow? Does that fall under justice just because the guy may have done something knowingly or unknowingly that was a minor violation of the law? So we have concepts and judgments need to be validated. We need, in order to have clarity about reality, in order to reach real knowledge. So there's a whole branch of philosophy called epistemology, which studies how do we gain genuine knowledge. And I'm going to say a few things along these lines. I highly recommend a lecture by my friend Greg Samieri, or a series of lectures called, I think it's Objective thinking or thinking objectively. You can find it on YouTube. Um, and this is all rooted in Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, which I think has the most powerful tools for clear thinking that I'm aware of. But I'm only going to touch on this briefly. The main thing I want to stress is more than the exact methods that you need to use as an individual to keep clarity. One of the most powerful things is just having a distinction in your mind between things that you know and things that you don't. And I would actually divide these up into 4 categories that I find really helpful. So one is just distinguishing cognitive content from emotional content. So we have, both awareness, or attempts at awareness, the cognitive content, and we have feelings, emotions. And so emotions are incredible. Emotions are our incentive to live life, our reward for living life well. But when we're trying to think, emotions are not automatically connected to reality. They don't tell us anything about reality. They kind of give us our kind of snap judgment of whether something is for or against us. And so when we're thinking and we're trying to achieve clarity, we need to separate our emotions. We need to separate wishes, hopes, and fears from knowledge. And so once we set that aside, though, that doesn't give us everything that we need, because not everything that's floating in our head and presenting itself as knowledge is knowledge. And so we want to distinguish one of at least 3 categories. So there's things I know, stuff that is conclusive, stuff that I'm confident to build further knowledge on and confident to act on. There's things I kind of know. This is stuff where I'm gathering evidence, but it's still at the level of possible or probable. There's nothing that contradicts it, but I just don't know enough yet to say with certainty, this is true. S is P. But then there's another category of things I haven't processed at all, and they might seem kind of appealing, or they resonate with me emotionally, or I heard them from a really smart person, but it's just interesting things I've heard, but I haven't gone through any kind of process to assess the idea's relationship to reality. And so having in your mind, so if you have things that I haven't processed, then you don't want to build anything on top of that. You don't want to use it in a reasoning process. You don't want to use it as the basis of action, because you don't know its actual relationship to reality. And the same thing is with things I kind of know, which is insofar as you have a choice and you can forgo acting on something, you don't want to treat that as stuff I know for certain. So how do we assess, whether we know something, whether we kind of know something, or whether it's just something we haven't processed? And, a really helpful question here is just, how does this compare to things that I really am confident that I know, things that I am really certain of? And particularly for people who are interested in philosophy, there's a tendency to just kind of know a little bit about a lot and not know anything really with a level of expertise. And one of the things I found is that it's very helpful to master one field. And so this doesn't mean necessarily having PhD level knowledge of a field, but knowing a field in depth is really powerful, because then it gives you a very comfortable home base from which to say, all right, I'm standing on solid ground. I've really thought about this issue. I really know what I'm talking about. I really know what it feels like to have clarity in this area. And then it becomes much easier to say, when you go into an area that maybe you're less familiar with, to say, okay, on this point, is this, the same as, does this have the same standing in my mind as in the field I spent the most time on? I mean, that was certainly true for me. When I started writing professionally, in fact, I was not an expert in any field by any stretch of the imagination. And then over the years, I've cultivated pretty in-depth knowledge of, a few fields, including economics, including the welfare state, Social Security, Medicare entitlements, finance, and energy. And knowing those fields really well has been hugely valuable when I turn to subjects that I don't know, because I can really feel like I can really uh, you know answer in a very crystallized way. Yeah, is this anything like the kind of clarity that I have about a concept in energy or a concept in finance? So here, I said I'm not going to go too much into depth on like strategies and principles of epistemology, but I just want to talk briefly about kind of four what you can think of as internal clarity tests. So one is concretization. So when I have an abstraction like freedom helps human beings flourish, or free trade is maximizes countries' prosperity. It One test of if I'm really clear on that idea is, can I give examples? Can I point to things in reality that are concrete instances of that principle? And because remember, abstractions are just our way of dealing with concretes that would be too numerous and too complex in order to deal with without abstractions. But you always want to maintain that tie to reality, and so being able to identify examples and think through examples is going to be enormously powerful in ensuring that you're clear on something. Next, there's devil's advocate, which you can think of as, are there counterexamples? Are there objections? What are the objections that people would raise? And here, this is not like you're going through an exercise so that you can answer your opponents. It means genuinely thinking, all right, what is the best argument against this point? And is there a real answer? And if not, well, that's great. Now I've learned something. I learned that my conclusion either isn't true or I just need to give it more thought. But it means really taking seriously that it's very easy to think that you're clear on an idea and not actually be clear. And so actively trying to poke holes in it is going to be one of the most powerful tools to sharpen your thinking. I mentioned before that knowledge builds on knowledge. It gets more and more abstract, more removed from what we can directly perceive. And so when we get very abstract ideas like, free trade, benefits all countries, then whenever we're using the idea, whenever we're applying it, whenever we're acting on it or building on this idea, we should do a quick check of, well, what's where did I get this idea? Why do I think it's true? And you give yourself a reminder of, all right, I learned it here from these kinds of observations. And if you're really thinking through an idea, like if you're writing a thesis paper or something, you want to keep asking, well, where did I get that idea? And where did I get that idea? All the way back until you get to things in reality you can directly perceive. But if you can't answer that question, or if the answer you give is not very satisfying, then you need to do more work to solidify the idea, to make sure you have that tie to reality, so that you know that your abstract knowledge, you understand it, you understand that it's true, and you understand how to apply it. And again, this is something that Greg goes into in his lecture on objective thinking, or thinking objectively, in a really helpful way, and something that is discussed in much more depth by Ayn Rand's top student, Leonard Peikoff, both in his book Objectivism, The Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and in some of his lecture courses, particularly Objectivism through Induction, which is it's some pretty advanced material. So I wouldn't necessarily start with that, but it is free online if you're really serious about improving your thinking skills. And finally, there's something I call the expert test, which is whenever we're dealing with a special science or an area where there's specialized knowledge at play, it is very easy to fool yourself and think, yeah, I can see what's true here very easily. But in order to be able to actually say that confidently, I think you have to have knowledge of, well, what do experts in this field think and why do they think it? And it's not that you necessarily have to agree with them, but if you haven't even done the work to answer that question with any level of depth, and then to be able to answer, well, this is why I disagree with the experts in the field, then you're not really thinking through the issue. Um, like that is, it's not that we have to bow to experts, but this idea that like somebody can read a few op-eds on climate change and say, oh no, the whole thing's a hoax because I read this, one thing that says CO2 can't warm the atmosphere. No, that is not real thinking, and you have not done the real work. And so, you want to push yourself by, ensuring, all right, if I'm going to delve into waters, which we should on areas where I can't be an expert, I at least want to be clear on what the experts are saying and why before I jump to any conclusions. Here's a point I wanted to go into. I mentioned earlier that concepts are not automatically valid. So a lot of the words that we use, particularly words that come up in contentious debates and in subjects like philosophy and policy and economics, are not legitimate concepts. They're not legitimate grouping together of things in reality under the same word. They differ in things like their moral status. They have fundamentally different the units, the things in reality that are being referred to. Those references are not essentially similar. They are very different. And so let me just give you one kind of homey example that I found really memorable. So William F. Buckley, whom I'm not a fan of, had one really great line, and I think I heard it from Jonah Goldberg, but it's, you can't point to a person who pushes old ladies in front of a bus and then a person who pushes old ladies out of the way of a bus and say, oh, those guys are the same. They like to push old ladies around. That is a package deal, right? You're taking a non-essential similarity, pushing old ladies, and dropping a fundamental difference, which is saving them or killing them. And many of the concepts that we use involve this kind of package dealing. Here's three really popular ones. So one is the concept of green, and apparently my image is not showing up for that, but that's all right. It does not add any cognitive content, just dazzle you with its aesthetic quality, or it would if it showed up. But green. So everybody's told we need to be green, but if you ask what's green, the kinds of things that are put under there, like it's combining anti-pollution with anti-impact. It's combining things that it's saying this is green because it doesn't involve dangerous, emissions that harm human beings, or it's green because this is not interfering with wilderness. It's not changing nature. But if you think those are radically different things, like if your goal is to maximize human flourishing, then you want to be anti-pollution. You want to reduce pollution as much as you can in a cost-effective way. But you don't want to reduce impact. You want to reduce negative impacts. We need to impact nature on a massive scale in order to flourish. So for example, take something like a sewage treatment plant. This is something that's incredibly anti-pollution, right? Like you're cleaning the water that you need in order to live. But it's not anti-impact. It's a major impact to build a sewage treatment plant, both just the sheer construction of it, the energy required to power it. And so like what green is doing is it's saying that if you want to be anti-pollution, you have to be anti-changing nature. And the truth is actually the exact opposite, that nature has a lot of natural pollution, and absent human development, just human beings existing on the earth, has all kinds of pollution, from things like burning wood and dung inside a home in order to heat it, absent like fossil fuel energy. So another very common one that comes up in discussions and debates is power. And this is usually used to obfuscate a fundamental distinction between economic power and political power. So, people complain that Mark Zuckerberg has too much power. Well, what is his power? Because we're made to think that he's exploiting us, he's controlling us. But all he has the power is he built something, and he says, here, if you want, you can use it. And if you use it, you have to do it on these terms. And if not, you can continue on your life as if I never existed, right? All he's offering is a positive that we're free to take on his terms or not. When he offers people a job at Facebook, he can't make anybody take the job. He can just offer them something he hopes will attract them, and they're free to take it or go on their way as if that job was never offered to him. That is completely different from political power, which is the power of the gun. So, when the government says to do something, you can't just go on your way as if the government didn't exist if you disagree. Like, if you try to go your own way, you will be thrown in jail. You'll be deprived of your ability to go on living your life. And so if we're combining these two under the same concept, then it's going to make a complete mess of our thinking because we're grouping together the voluntary and the coercive. Libertarian's an interesting one because my views are typically, when I talk to people, will be classified as libertarian. And I don't get up in arms about that. But the reason I don't use the term is because it's packaging together things that are fundamentally dissimilar. So my view is one of limited government. As you have a government that has one single function: to protect our rights, to protect the individual's rights from being violated by the initiation of physical force. And a government that doesn't do that, like, that's a disaster. And then a government that actively violates rights is a disaster. So limited government is the position I support. But libertarianism will also refer to people who hold it might be fair, arguably, to call it unlimited government, but let's at least say a government that is not limited to protecting rights. So, you'll have bleeding heart libertarians who basically talk about like a so-called libertarian welfare state where it's redistributing wealth or even a guaranteed basic income. You'll have, but then the big one that I would not want to be packaged together because I think it is fundamentally anti-liberty, is anarchism. That if you think about what limited government is, it's removing physical force from human relationships. It's placing retaliatory force under the control of objective laws and saying, like, no, you can't just go around using force just because you think you're justified. We're going to have a process that's open, transparent, everybody can see it, and is impersonal, that is going to do as best as is possible for us to make the use of force used only in objective ways so that everybody knows it's retaliatory, everybody knows what the consequences of initiating force will be. And anarchy says, no, we're just going to throw that out and anybody can use force whenever they want. And I understand that there's all of these alleged arguments about, like, oh, economic incentives will do X, Y, Z, but no, in the end, it's you're saying, if you have a system that removes force from human relationships, no, we want to overthrow that and everybody can use force whenever they want. And I think the actual examples of that are complete, total social breakdown. It is, it is basically and essentially and in reality the rule of brute force. And so if you have a concept like libertarian that's saying, well, these are basically the same. I mean, that's like literally like trying to combine my view of limited capitalist government with totalitarian communism and saying, well, they're essentially similar because they both have governments. that is going to wreck your thinking. So one more point on that before we move on. So I just want to say, being on the premise of, particularly when you hear new terminology and contentious issues, not automatically embracing it, even if it seems like, yeah, that's a useful word, pausing like, why did we need this new word, and what is being grouped together, and does that really belong grouped together? Or things being misclassified, because as you can see, it's very useful if you're anti-freedom to have a concept like power that allows you to say, oh, these rich capitalists are slave drivers. If you want to eliminate production and progress, it's very useful to be able to like trick people by essentially saying, well, hey, if you want clean air and water, you have to be opposing human development. So now let's turn to communication and ask, what is clear communication? And in one sense, it's really simple, right? It's, what did I want to say, and did I say it? And if you can answer that, then your communication is clear. But we want to have a really high standard for this. And the way I think of it is that the goal is a level of clarity so that you get, on the audience's part, effortless consumption of the material that adds up to an overwhelmingly obvious conclusion. So effortless consumption and overwhelmingly obvious conclusion. And when I say effortless consumption, I really discovered this back in my early 20s. There were a handful of writers that I would read where I would start reading and it would be like my eyes would just effortlessly drift down to the end of the piece, and at the end I would say, oh, of course, how could I have never thought, like, there was no, I could later, like, the best writers you could go and read slower and get more out of as you paid more attention and asked more questions, but just the process of reading felt effortless. There was nothing that was confusing, nothing that slowed you down or tripped you up or say, well, wait, what does this mean? Why are we talking about this point right now? And that's really what we want to shoot for when we're trying to achieve external clarity. So we can break down external clarity into three things. So structural clarity, line-by-line clarity, and word clarity. Structural clarity is the audience understands your argument and conclusion. They can grasp the whole overarching goal of the piece and how you tried to execute it. Line-by-line clarity is that the audience can understand each sentence and understand how each sentence relates to what comes before and what comes after, what follows. And then you can break that down finally to word clarity, which is that each word communicates exactly what you intend. So just to give you an example of how even good writers can go wrong, I want to share with you one of the earliest things that I ever published. This was edited by a few other people over a course of time, and yet I still think it ended up as being really problematic, although I didn't see that at the time. So, and I want you to pay attention to the way that I'm reading this and thinking about it. So I'll read the headline, but we're not going to critique that because authors seldom write their own headlines. I don't know who wrote this one. It might have been me, so I'm not blaming the publisher or anybody else, but we're just going to dive right in. So let's start. The Federal Communications Commission recently asked Congress to hand it broad powers to regulate excessive violence on TV. All right, so scare quotes, first of all, are guilty until proven innocent, because am I quoting that? Am I disagreeing with that and saying that's a bad phrase? And if so, why? So I already have raised a question in the reader's mind that I don't necessarily want to answer at this point. The way it currently restricts indecent speech. So again, scare quotes, regular quotes, who knows? All right, colon. Broadcasters who violate the FCC's limitations on excessive violence will face crippling fines and potentially the loss of their broadcast licenses. So first of all, this is just a very long first sentence. But I mean, at least we can get the situation, right? Like, they're asking for power to regulate violence, and similar to the way they regulated indecency, and this will lead to major negative consequences for people who violate this. So, not a great opening, some confusing things, or at least things that will slow people down. But then we get to this. Isn't it time to ask, how did a country that reveres free speech end up with a government agency that imposes continually expanding speech restrictions, and where will those restrictions end? So first of all, I think it's arguable that when you raise a question, it's tempting to think you can just raise a question and the reader is going to go along with it. But you don't want to raise a question that the reader wouldn't actually have and wouldn't actually have at this point. This one I think is a little bit borderline. Like, maybe they'll be with you of like, yeah, these seem like a lot of speech regulations for a country that supposedly supports free speech. I think where those restrictions will end is a little bit ambiguous. But I'm not convinced 100% that that's a real question that they would have, because part of what I'm assuming that they would see the regulation of excessive violence and indecent speech as restrictions on free speech. And maybe that's true. I don't remember exactly what audience I had in mind for that. But, it's not like these things are completely unpopular. And so I think it's a real question of whether the audience is going to go along with, yeah, these are clearly violations of free speech. And the only question is, how did we end up here and where will this go next? I think that's being assumed, and I don't know that we can assume it. Now we come to a just freaking nightmare of a paragraph. So now we're going to define free speech. Free speech means the right to express the products of the mind. So, I'm just going to read the whole sentence and then we'll pick it apart. Free speech means the right to express the products of the mind, scientific conclusions, artistic creations, political views, etc., using whatever words or images one chooses over a medium one can rightfully access without interference by the government. My God. I mean, really, this is supposed to be the definition and crystallization of the most important concept in the whole piece. And it's wordy. It has a bunch of phrases that who the hell knows what they mean. Like, what are products of the mind? And then are these examples of them? Scientific conclusions, artistic create. Like, why didn't I just say ideas? Like, using whatever words or images one chooses. So why don't I just say, it's the right to express any idea one can rightfully access over a medium one can rightfully access. What in God's name is this guy talking about? Without interference by the government. So, everything is wrong with this. But can you see what I'm trying to do? What I'm trying to do is squeeze into the definition every later possible elaboration one could ever want to make about what free speech means and what it requires. I'm not defining free speech. I'm trying to catalog it in the space of a sentence. And the result is that nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. And even if they could kind of figure it out, well, why is he defining it in this weird way? Like, that's such an unfamiliar term. And is that what people were walking around thinking when they crystallized the idea of free speech? Well, clearly we mean products of the mind over a medium that we can rightfully access. Like, come on. Like, what was I smoking? All right, so anyway, I go on. It means the right of a publisher to publish a controversial novel. Okay, good. The right of a newspaper to run an article criticizing the government. Good. And the right of broadcasters to decide what content will flow over their airwaves. So this is not bad. The last clause, though, the dash at the end is sort of indicating that, all right, I'm setting up something that I'm going to elaborate on more in a minute. I'm emphasizing in a way that says, all right, I'm not expecting you to buy this yet. This is what I'm going to set out to prove. is that that it includes the right of broadcasters to decide what content will flow over their airwaves. But notice, in kind of suggesting that I'm going to prove that, my assumption is the reader isn't already convinced of that. And if they're not already convinced of that, then we get back to the problem in the first paragraph of assuming that they regard these FCC regulations as violations of free speech. So anyway, now we get into the next paragraph, which is mostly it's a little historical background, but let's see if we can see anything in there. But in 1927, just as radios were becoming widely used, the government seized control of the airwaves, declaring them public property, and assumed the power to regulate them in the name of the public interest, again with these scare quotes. An unidentifiable term that can be stretched to mean anything. This is again borderline. I'm not convinced that a reader is going to get why that term is undefinable and that it can really be stretched to mean anything. But I think in an op-ed, it's borderline. It's certainly not the ideal of effortless consumption and overwhelmingly obvious conclusions, but it's not a fiasco necessarily. Thus, broadcasters' right to free speech was cut off at the root. That's actually literally true if you understand, the root of free speech is tied to property rights, but that is not a perspective that the reader has, is the link between property and free speech, so I don't think they'll get cut off at the root. As the government, having irrationally barred broadcasters from owning the airwaves they made valuable through their technological information and broadcast content, went on to dictate how those airwaves could be used. A little wordy, but not bad. I think irrationally barred broadcasters from owning the airwaves. Again, you're kind of assuming, I think a reader who's unfamiliar with the history will say, well, didn't they have a good reason? And if they are familiar with the history, they at least know that the government offered certain reasons that I'm not getting into. So I'm sort of just asserting they irrationally barred broadcasters from owning the airwaves, and that the reader will get that the broadcasters made those airwaves valuable. In fact, now that I'm looking at this again, that is not actually anywhere close to objective and effortless, because the idea that they made the airwaves valuable is a really, I think, controversial idea, because most people would say, no, this is a natural resource that was naturally valuable. And I think it actually takes a lot of work to get somebody to see that no, it was similar to a raw material that human beings had to make valuable by discovering them, by discovering radio waves and discovering how to harness them. So again, I think I'm not really connected to the reader in a way where I'm able to just give him stuff that he can take in effortlessly and see clearly. All right, now we get to the next paragraph. Initially, the government pledged that only obscene speech, materials that depict or describe patently offensive hardcore sexual contact, would be barred from the air. But having abandoned the principle of free speech and established itself as the unchecked arbiter of what could be said in the airwaves, the government was later able to ignore its pledge, and in 1978's FCC versus Pacifico ruling, expand its speech restrictions to include the broader and even more nebulous category of indecent speech. The piece goes on. There's more problems down here. The one other, I think there was a couple others that I just want to leap forward to. So the real heart of the argument is I'm giving this progression of more and more regulation, and I say if we allow this progression to continue, it's only a matter of time before the FCC starts restricting offensive philosophic or scientific views, as some religious opponents of evolution would like, and having gutted free speech on radio and television, what is to stop the government from censoring the internet, books, and newspapers? So that's somewhat, it's mostly clear as far as it goes. It's not a great argument. Whenever you're kind of pushed to making a slippery slope argument, then what you're really saying is, it's not really a big deal about what's happening now, but just you wait, it'll lead to something bad in the future. And the only kind of slippery slope arguments that I think are good are ones where you're saying, look, this is bad, this is outrageous, and it's only going to get worse in the future. So you need to see it as like, we're already on a bad trajectory, we're already on a bad principle, and so it's just a matter of where that principle ultimately leads. So that is not so much an issue of clarity, although it is relevant to persuasion overall. So what was what I really want to get to then is the next paragraph, how that starts. What made this trend toward increasing censorship possible and inevitable? That is not a question that the reader has, not even at this point. Like, I have this, I have my, previous question, what's to stop the government from censoring internet books and newspapers? Well, now as the reader, what I'm expecting is an elaboration on there is nothing to stop, and so, this is really bad, or this is what the consequences of that will be. Whatever it is, I'm not expecting another question following that question that just goes in a completely different direction and asks, what made this trend toward increasing censorship possible and inevitable? Nobody had that question, particularly not the inevitable question. And so again, part of what I'm stressing here is, as we're going to see, transitions are a place where we often lose the reader. They don't know why we're going there, where we are in the argument, what it's all adding up to. Transitions are a big one, and in particular, transitions in the form of a question the reader doesn't have are a huge red flag. So whenever you find yourself transitioning with a question, it's not always wrong, but you really have to think, is this the question the reader would naturally have after what came before? And here, clearly, I was just throwing in a question because I had something to say and wanted to kind of strong arm the reader to following me here. So I'm gonna, I think I'm gonna retire that article, and we'll move on. But I hope you can see the myriad ways in which somebody who, is allegedly a professional writer, and who has editors, can still violate clarity. The argument wasn't clear. The relationship between the points wasn't clear. I was using words, that were not clear. And so the net result was something that was completely unreadable and unclear. So one tactic, and this is really for the issue of structural clarity, is to master outlines. And look, I get it. I will admit, for a long time, even when I preached the virtue of outlines, I did not outline. If I did outline, it wasn't really an outline. It was like a couple notes of, I'll make this point, and then I'll make this point, and maybe something like that point. Since then, really in the last 3 years, I've become, let's say, certainly a much better outliner, and I outline much more commonly. I won't say I'm 100%, particularly in shorter pieces where I feel like I can hold the structure in mind. But I become much more devoted to outlining, and I see the value. So we'll talk about outlining in lesson 6, I think it is, when we talk about process. But one of the things I want to assure you is part of what I'm going to discuss there is how to not have outlining become a duty that slows you down and robs you of the joy of writing. How to make it something that will actually be an asset to you, even if you really don't like it, and even if in the past you've tried it and dropped it. But outlining is the surest way to master structure and to really get an enormous leap forward in your level of clarity. I indicated this when I looked at my piece, but I want to highlight just that unclear transitions are a big place where you'll fall short in clarity. And it's very easy not to notice it, because there's this tendency to think, well, a paragraph is a reset and I can just take things in whatever direction that I want. And I mean, you can, nobody will shoot you if you do it, but you will, if not lose the reader, at least for a moment confuse him. And our goal should be the reader is never confused, never for one moment. Not, well, if they keep reading, eventually they'll be able to kind of concoct how this relates to what came before. No, we want zero confusion. This is a very narrow thing, but I notice that I make this mistake all the time. When I'm not clear in a transition, very often I'll have a paragraph that begins with this or that, and it's referring to something about the previous paragraph, but it's not always clear what. Is it the last point? Is it the overall point of the paragraph? What exactly is the relationship between this new paragraph and the one that came before? It's not like there's a rule that says you can never start a paragraph with this or that. I'm just flagging it as like that's something to pay attention to. So here's a tactic if you want to really make sure that you're keeping a structure that is effortless to follow. And that is, write your piece as a single paragraph and read it aloud. So there's a tendency when we read to, in effect, give ourselves permission, as I mentioned, when we go to a new paragraph to do like a little reset. And that's important for a reader to have that there. But as the writer, when you're editing yourself, no, you should be able to read something as a totally fluid single paragraph, no jarring changes in direction, and then you can break it up later. So give that a shot and see, does the piece read smoothly and effortlessly without paragraph breaks, or is a single paragraph? So here's another common mistake, and that's assuming that what's in your head is on the page. And this is a very hard thing to overcome, because like you have this automatized context in your head that, when you read the words, you see your intention, and it's hard to read things straight and ask, is what I'm trying to say actually right here, so that somebody else from my intended audience will get exactly what I mean. But that's what you have to strive to do. So here's just one example. If you're thinking of raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, you need maximum compassion, and liberals don't have it. Promises of more money for lots of people can make voters ridiculously happy if they don't understand that more for some always means less for others. So the liberals get elected, do their thing, and ruin the lives of the poorest and most disadvantaged of our fellow citizens. Now, I know what this author intended this to mean, because anybody who's been around reading free market oriented writing for a long time knows that the argument is that if you raise the minimum wage, then people whose skills are not such that they are productive enough to be profitable at that wage will be out of work. And so the minimum wage actually comes at the expense of the people it allegedly helps. But if you think somebody who's not heard that argument, how are they thinking of the minimum wage? Well, maybe they get that it means less for others, but they would think of it as, no, it's less for these wealthy business owners. And so jumping to this will ruin the lives of the poorest and most disadvantaged, it's completely baffling. And the point is that what is in the writer's head was not on the page. He didn't make the point about why it is that a $15 minimum wage helps those poorest and most disadvantaged. It's just asserted, and it's asserted, I assume, because for him it's just obvious. This is something that, obviously the minimum wage is going to throw people out of work. So here's a tactic I learned from Leonard Peikoff, who has a lot of really valuable stuff to say on communication. And his advice was, you write something, you write a draft of it, and set it aside, as long as you can. and then come back to it and read the piece as if it was written by someone you vaguely dislike. And you can contrast that to reading it as if it's by somebody that you like, in which case you're going to be too friendly to it and not spot as many problems or areas for improvement as you otherwise would. But you don't want to read it in a hostile way, because there you can poke holes in anything. So it's someone that you vaguely dislike, and you're just a little bit on guard, looking for, is this really true? What does this formulation mean? Is this clear? Just having that little bit of skepticism about the piece as you go through and edit it. And I found that really helpful. All right, so now I want to talk about some clarity tools. These are specific tactics or tools you can think of that you can deploy in your writing in order to help make things clear to the reader. So one obvious one is examples, which is if you're going to use an abstraction stands for instances. It stands for concretes in reality. We talked about that earlier. And the point is that in your thinking, you have to form your abstraction from a bunch of concrete perceptual examples. But when you're communicating, you have to give an attenuated, abbreviated version of that same process, which is if you have an abstraction to know, let the reader know what you mean, examples can be really helpful. And so one of the good things that you saw in my disaster of a piece on free speech is, I gave examples. For instance, I used that phrase, products of the mind, which is an awful phrase. But then I list some examples so the reader knew what I had. I think it was something like, books, artistic creations, radio broadcasts, whatever the case may be. But the point is, I had this abstraction that was unfamiliar, and so I'm going to give concrete examples in order to deal with it. So if you find yourself stringing together a bunch of abstractions, you very likely somewhere need some examples, particularly if it's an unfamiliar idea or an unfamiliar concept. Related are analogies, and an analogy is a comparison, right? And what you're really trying to do with an analogy is you're trying to illuminate the unfamiliar by connecting it to the familiar. So let me give an example. This is the best analogy I feel I've ever come up with, because once I came up with the analogy, I finally understood the issue. So this is really about the way in which utilities, in particular we're talking about energy utilities, can have a financial incentive to build things that aren't actually needed by the market. And so let me just read it, and I think you'll see how this analogy is so powerful. Because most people are not very familiar with utility finance, and it can be really complicated to understand. So here we go. So why is this particular utility pushing so hard for a plan to prematurely retire coal plants and replace them with expensive new generation that will bring no tangible benefit to customers? Because the more it spends on infrastructure, even if the infrastructure is unnecessary, the more it's allowed to charge us for electricity. This problem, known as gold plating, is a perennial issue with utilities, and it's the reason why utilities need regulator approval before they invest in infrastructure projects. Think of it this way. Suppose you hire a contractor to renovate your kitchen, and instead of agreeing on a specific price, you tell him you'll cover the cost plus a 10% profit. You figure the job will run him about $20,000 and give him a profit of $2,000. Instead, you come home to find that he's replaced your appliances with versions that cost twice as much and work half as well as the old ones, and added a bunch of granite countertops that you didn't want or need. Now he hands you a bill for $50,000 plus $5,000 for his profit. That's basically what this utility is doing with its plan. By prematurely shutting down coal units and replacing them with pricey new gas and solar installations, the utility will be able to hike its rates, guaranteeing it a giant profit, and guaranteeing us more expensive electricity. I might have missed not included some setup here so that you can get exactly what's going on, but the idea was I've already explained that utilities are allowed to increase their prices based on their capital expenditures. They get government permission to do that, so they can recoup those costs. And now I'm trying to explain how does that give them more profitability. And you can see it's because their profitability is based on a percentage profit on top of the costs. And so the higher the cost, the more that percentage of profit turns into cold hard cash. And so this analogy to something that is so financing for utilities, their profit model, that's hard to relate to. It's hard to think about. But if we relate to something that's more familiar, which is a contractor on a cost plus arrangement, it just becomes far easier to understand. So finally, our third one rather is definitions, and this is identifying the nature of the unit subsumed under a concept. It's you give somebody a word, right? And the definition is saying, well, look, I'm referring to these things in reality. Here's what they're most similar to, and here's what makes them distinct. So, just a simple example is Aristotle's definition of man as the rational animal. So we have the things that human beings are most similar to, animals. That's the wider category from which we're being distinguished. And then what distinguishes us? What makes us distinct from other animals that we're similar to? And it's that we have the capacity to reason. We survive by our minds. And so a definition is going to allow us to have clarity of our concepts. And one of the problems that you run into in a lot of political discussions for existence is people will have either vague ideas or different ideas about things like what is justice, what are rights, what is freedom, what is liberty. And defining your terms is going to be really key to making sure that your audience understands contentious or confusing terminology or new terminology in the same way that you do. Here's 3 things that I learned specifically from Alex Epstein, because they're particularly helpful in a field like energy for various reasons that hopefully will become clear as I go through them. But these are just super powerful clarity tools. So one is normalization, and it's a comparison that helps us put negatives into perspective. So if I just come out and say, look, and I'm just making up the numbers here, but if I say like, look, there's 1 in 1,000 chance that this pipeline will break and spill, thousands of gallons of oil in this area. Well, by itself, if all you hear is that negative, well, that's a negative. Like, why are we just adding negatives onto our lives? But if you can compare it to other risks, so maybe a better example? A better example is we'll hear that fracking causes earthquakes. Well, that sounds really bad. But if we normalize it and say, look, these are small tremors that are not much different usually than the equivalent of what you get when a big truck rolls by or from a construction site, that puts a negative. It puts a negative impact into perspective. It's no longer scary. We can relate to it. It becomes much more normal. Just as a general rule, this is particularly important for things that are numerical or statistical, is that usually the numbers don't have any meaning by themselves. They have to be related to other things. And so when we're dealing with negatives for the things that we think are good, we want to put those negatives into perspective. Then there's also this issue of superiorization. And this is a comparison that helps us put positives into perspective. So, for example, in the energy debate, um, one of the things is fossil fuel companies will often not talk about their positives, but when they do, it's never comparative, or it's almost never comparative. It's, we fuel your car, we heat your home, we keep your lights on. All of that's true, but people will say, okay, but that's just what any energy source will do. Why can't we replace yours with someone else? Whereas if you contrast that with, like, if you remember Steve Jobs's presentations where he would compare directly the what the iPhone was capable of with what competitors were capable of, and say, like, look, these positives are superior to the alternatives. Well, that's why I want an iPhone. I don't want an iPhone because it has this, much memory storage or whatever. It's no, it has more than the alternatives. It has better than the alternatives. We want to show the superiority of the positives of our side and make those clear. And then finally, visual remodeling. And this helps us grasp proper causal models and eliminate false causal models. I apologize for the typo in there. We form mental pictures of how the world works, and those mental pictures are often completely wrong. I remember the first time Alex explained this to me was many years ago, making the point that most people think of, like, drilling for oil, like sticking a giant straw into the ground and sucking out oil. And I was like, yeah, those people are idiots. And inside I was like, well, that's pretty much what I imagined too. And what you want is, to understand something, you need a proper model of how it works. So a really good example to see why this is important would be something like fracking, which is, if you get a scale model of where fracking occurs, you see how deep it is under the ground, how far below the waterbed, and therefore it becomes much less frightening that, oh, this is going to pollute our groundwater, because we can get, oh, look, things drill, near groundwater all the time, and this is super far underground, which makes it far, far less likely that there'll be water contamination from fracking. So those are the 6 clarity tools I wanted to discuss. Now I want to discuss one final tactic. So I took a screenwriting class from a man named Corey Mandel, who's just amazing, and the class was incredible. And one of the assignments he had us do, which just was revolutionary to me and super helpful, was, usually when we get feedback from other people, it's like, here, can you tell me what you think? Was this good? Was this not good? Did you like it? And Corey said, that is not very useful. And he, in the field of screenwriting, he said that the problem is that, people would be getting really bad responses to their work. And yet, when he would talk to them one-on-one about their project, he found himself, more often than not, riveted. But what was happening was the movie playing in the head of the writer was not the same movie playing in the head of the reader. And so he came up with a list of questions that you, as the writer, had to give, 3 friends or whomever is going to read your script and say, look, I want you to answer these. And the questions were not evaluative. They would say, like, look, you're not being tested, I the writer am. And all the questions were designed to do was to elicit from those readers if the movie playing in their head was the one that the writer intended, the one playing in the writer's head. And so the result was that if he passed that test, then he knew one thing, but it was one crucial thing, that the story was clear. And just as in nonfiction, if something's not clear, nothing else matters. The same thing is true in screenwriting. And so what I suggest to writers in persuasive content, or somebody who's giving a speech, is as you're working to develop your internal ability to judge how clear your writing is, and you can always do this, you can do it forever, but I don't think you have to do it forever. I think you have to do it, certainly you have to do it early on, or do something like it early on, so that you can really build your antenna of clarity. But essentially what you're going to do is you're going to write something, and you're going to ask somebody to read it and say, like, I want you to answer this question when you're done. And you're not being tested. This is not if you're smart or intelligent. This is to test me, the writer, and see if I'm doing my job. So if you can't do this, that's my failing. So what you have to do is, once you finish reading it, set it aside. Don't look at it again. And I want you to tell me, what is the conclusion of this piece, and what's the argument for that conclusion? Just, all you have to do is summarize that. You don't have to tell me whether you thought it was good, whether you thought it was interesting, whether you thought I made my case, whether you thought like everything was just a complete embarrassment. All you have to do is write down what you think my conclusion was and what you think my argument was. And I think you'll be really, really surprised at the responses. But what you can work towards is you can either follow up with them if they did not come up with the right answer, and all three need to come up with the right answer. And then you keep doing that until the argument conclusion that's in your head is the same one in the reader's head. So do that, and I can't guarantee exactly how much time it will take, but my guess is that after only a few examples of doing that and really making sure that you have made your piece genuinely clear, you'll develop a much stronger internal sense of when your writing is clear and when it's not. So that's it for this lesson. Join me for lesson 3, where we're going to dive into context and framing. Until then, this is Don Watkins, and you've been listening to Persuasion Mastery.